The Ghostly Caller. Hello friends, welcome to the horror ghost stories. The story begins. The night was unusually quiet, the kind of stillness that pressed in on your ears, as if the world was holding its breath. In a small, rural town nestled between rolling hills, there stood an old farmhouse at the edge of the woods. Its windows, once gleaming with light, now sat dark and empty, the wooden boards that lined the porch aged and weathered by the years. No one had lived there for quite some time, at least, no one living. Yet, rumors of strange occurrences had persisted over the years. Some said the house was haunted. Others, more superstitious, claimed the farmhouse was cursed. It had been a year since anyone had dared to speak of the place, let alone venture near it. But on one cold autumn evening, a new resident, a young woman named Claire, moved into the house next door. Her reasons for choosing the quiet, isolated location were simple: she needed to escape the noise of the city, to find peace and start over. She had no idea about the house's troubled past. Claire had heard whispers when she first arrived, the brief mentions of that house at the edge of town, but she dismissed them as nothing more than idle gossip. She had always been a skeptic, someone who didn't believe in ghosts or curses. To her, they were just stories people told to entertain themselves, nothing more. On her first night in the new home, Claire sat by the fireplace, her feet curled under a warm blanket, the faint hum of a music playlist filling the room. Her eyes flickered across the room, a soft flicker of unease creeping into her chest. The house was cozy enough, old, but with character. The walls creaked every now and then, settling into the silence. It wasn't until the clock struck 10 that she heard it. A soft, almost inaudible sound at first. A faint knock. Claire froze. Her heart skipped, and she sat motionless, straining to hear it again. A second knock, louder this time. It came from the front door. Her mind raced. Could it be someone who had gotten lost, someone looking for help, or was it a prank, some trick played by the locals? She stood slowly, taking a deep breath to steady herself. The house was still, but the quiet only heightened the sense of unease. She crossed the room cautiously, her footsteps echoing against the floorboards, her hand reaching for the doorknob. As her fingers grazed it, the door creaked open by itself. She jerked her hand back, eyes wide, her breath quickening. Nobody stood on the other side of the door. It was pitch black outside, the only light coming from the moon, which cast long shadows on the porch. For a moment, Claire stood still, her heart pounding in her chest. She thought about closing the door and returning to the safety of the fireplace, but curiosity gnawed at her. She stepped out onto the porch, peering into the dark night. The wind rustled the dry leaves on the ground, but there was no other sound. No one was there. Confused and unsettled, Claire stepped back inside and shut the door. She locked it tightly. Perhaps it was just the wind, or maybe she was just being paranoid. Yet, as she returned to her seat, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and the sense of something being wrong only grew. She tried to focus on the music playing, to calm herself, but it was no use. Something wasn't right. Her mind kept drifting back to the door, and the feeling that she was being watched. Then, there it was again, louder this time. A knock. A deliberate knock. It came from the back door this time. Claire's stomach lurched. She had no explanation for it. No logical reason why this was happening. Her breathing grew shallow, her body stiff with fear. She glanced toward the hallway that led to the kitchen, where the back door was. The shadows there seemed to stretch out farther than they should have. The knock came again. Her heart raced as she stood, unable to move at first. Finally, she forced herself to walk toward the kitchen, her hands trembling at her sides. The kitchen was dark except for a small light above the stove, casting eerie shadows across the walls. She slowly approached the back door, her steps slow and deliberate, her hand gripping the handle. When she reached it, she hesitated for a moment, listening. No sound came from the other side. Taking a deep breath, Claire opened the door. Nothing. The night air rushed in, cold and biting. The yard beyond was empty, the trees swaying gently in the wind. No person, no figure standing in the shadows. Claire's mind raced. She quickly slammed the door shut, locking it behind her. This wasn't just some prank anymore. There was something wrong here, something she couldn't explain. She retreated back to the living room, pacing in tight circles, trying to steady her thoughts. But it was no use. The knocking continued. Knock. 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 It was constant now, a rhythmic pounding that seemed to reverberate through the house. She covered her ears, but the sound persisted. It came from the walls, the floors, the doors everywhere. She was losing her grip on reality. Finally, she couldn't take it any longer. With a trembling hand, she grabbed the phone from the coffee table and dialed the only number she had, the number of the old man who lived in the farmhouse next door. He had greeted her on her first day, offering advice on the town, though his eyes had been strangely distant, like he knew more than he was letting on. The phone rang once, twice, and then the line clicked. Hello, came a gravelly voice, thick with sleep. Mr. Alston. Claire's voice was shaky. I need help. There's something wrong with this house. There's knocking, but nobody is there. Stop, he interrupted, his voice suddenly sharper. Do not open the door. Do not let them in. She froze, his words like ice down her spine. What do you mean? What's happening? I don't understand. He was silent for a long moment, the only sound on the other end a low, distant sigh. You moved into the house, didn't you? Claire's heart skipped. Yes, she whispered, unsure where the conversation was going. It's not just an old house, child. It's cursed, he said, his voice low and urgent. Years ago, a family lived there. A mother, a father, and their 2 children. But one night, the parents went mad. They started hearing knocking too. Strange knocking in the walls, in the floors, in the very air. They were desperate to silence it, to rid the house of whatever cursed them. But they couldn't. They died trying. They tried to get out, but the house kept them there. The children, too. They were lost. Claire's mind was reeling. What happened to them? What do you mean, lost? They never left, he replied softly. They still haunt that place. They call to those who come near, trying to find someone to let them in. They need to be freed. But anyone who opens the door to them is dragged into the darkness. They want to rest until they have you. Until they take you with them. Claire's breath caught in her throat as the knocks grew louder again, a chaotic pounding that shook the walls. She spun around, her eyes darting around the room, her heart hammering in her chest. "Mr. Alston, what do I do?" she begged, but the line was already silent. He was gone. Her gaze fell to the front door. The handle began to turn on its own. A cold chill swept through her. The knocking was now mixed with soft whispers, voices too faint to understand, but they were there. They were speaking to her, calling her name. And they were waiting for her to open the door. Claire screamed. She couldn't fight it anymore. She couldn't stop the fear, the dread that swallowed her whole. She turned toward the door, shaking as she stepped closer. The whispers were louder now, frantic, desperate. They were coming for her. With a final, terrified glance toward the phone now silent, she reached for the door handle. And as her hand touched it, the house seemed to breathe. The air around Claire grew colder, almost painfully so. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps, her body trembling not from the chill but from the terror that gripped her heart. She couldn't move. Her fingers hovered over the doorknob, but her mind screamed at her to stop, to turn around and run. Yet, the whispers, the voices became louder, more frantic. It was as though they were coming from inside her own head, coaxing her, urging her to open the door. The knocking intensified, no longer rhythmic, but erratic, like a frantic plea. Each knock felt like a strike against her soul, as though the house itself was alive, hungry for something, pulling at her with invisible threads. It was no longer just a knock. It felt like an invitation, a trap, waiting for her to succumb. Claire's heart raced, and in that moment, she understood the horror. It wasn't the house that was cursed, it was the very land, the very essence of it. She had walked into something far older and darker than she could have imagined. Her hand, still hovering over the door, grew ice cold. Her skin tingled, and a sense of overwhelming dread settled in her chest. The door handle seemed to pulsate under her touch, as if it had a life of its own. The whispers began to form words, now soft, broken, desperate. "Let us in," they begged. "We are waiting. Come to us. Free us." With a sharp gasp, Claire pulled her hand back, her pulse hammering in her throat. She stumbled backward, her legs unsteady, her mind racing with thoughts of escape, but she felt paralyzed. There was nowhere to run. The walls seemed to close in around her. The very air felt thick, suffocating. Suddenly, the door rattled violently, as though something or someone on the other side was trying to force their way in. Claire's mind screamed to flee, but her legs wouldn't obey. She was frozen in place, unable to move, trapped in that unbearable moment. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the rattling stopped. The silence that followed was so deafening that it felt like the whole world had stilled. Claire's breathing echoed in the quiet, ragged, and panicked. She dared not look at the door, but she could feel it there, just beyond her vision, waiting. She turned slowly toward the living room, her feet moving without thought. She needed to leave, needed to get out of this house. Her mind was clouded with fear and confusion. The phone, still silent, lay discarded on the coffee table. Her thoughts were fragmented. She needed to get help. But the house had other plans. It was then that she heard a soft click. The door to the kitchen had opened by itself, unnoticed by her until now. Claire's stomach dropped, and her eyes darted toward the darkened hallway. She hadn't opened that door. She was certain of it. Then came the sound of soft footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching from the kitchen. Claire held her breath, not daring to make a sound, her body pressing against the wall, every nerve on edge. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her legs refused to move, heavy and weak. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just behind her, at the threshold of the living room. A cold breath grazed her neck, a touch so icy it sent a shock of fear through her bones. Claire's heart raced wildly in her chest, her head spinning with a sense of hopelessness. "Please," a voice whispered, faint and sorrowful. It was a voice that could have been human once, but now it was a hollow echo, a whisper from the grave. "Please, don't leave us." The air around her shifted, and Claire's eyes locked onto the figure that stood in the doorway. It was a man, or at least, it had been once. His skin was pale, almost translucent, his clothes tattered and old, as if they had not been touched by time for decades. His eyes were wide and unblinking, empty sockets that seemed to stare straight through her. His mouth moved, but no words came out, only a soft, drawn breath that chilled her to the core. Claire wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but her body wouldn't obey. The figure reached out with a hand, its fingers long and thin, covered in grime and dirt. Slowly, it took a step toward her, and Claire's mind screamed in protest. "No," she whispered, her voice weak, barely audible. "No." The figure stopped, its face twisting into a grotesque mockery of a smile, the corners of its mouth pulling into something that resembled a grimace more than a human expression. The whispers behind it grew louder, more insistent, as if the whole house was alive with them now. "Help us, free us." The figure rasped, its voice breaking. "We are lost." Claire felt her body tremble. Her mind was unraveling, each thought slipping away into the darkness. The whispers were all around her now, pressing in from every direction, like a chorus of mournful voices, all demanding the same thing: "Let us in." And then, as if in response to her inner turmoil, the temperature in the room dropped. The chill was unbearable, like 1,000 icy hands caressing her skin, sinking deep into her bones. Her breath became visible, a pale mist in the air. From the corners of her vision, she saw shapes moving. Figures, shrouded in shadow, materializing from the darkness. They were everywhere now, filling the room with their cold presence. They reached out, their fingers like claws, their faces twisted in agony and rage. Claire finally found her voice, though it was faint, trembling. "No. Get away from me." The figures moved closer, the air around them thick with malevolent energy. They were closing in on her, their whispers growing louder, filling her mind with images of death, despair, and darkness. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The fear consumed her, drowning out everything else. They were here. And they were not going to leave. Then, in the deepest recesses of her mind, Claire heard something, the faintest whisper, different from the others. It was a voice she recognized, soft and distant, but it filled her with a strange sense of hope. "Claire, you have to leave. You have to break free." It was Mr. Alston's voice. With what little strength she had left, Claire closed her eyes and focused on his words. He had warned her. He had told her not to open the door. But there was something else he had said: You have to leave. And in that moment, Claire understood. This house was not just cursed, it was a prison, a place where the souls of the lost were trapped, and they could not leave unless they took someone with them. The realization hit her like a slap to the face. The only way out was to escape, to break the cycle. With one final surge of adrenaline, Claire ran. She pushed through the figures, shoving them aside as they tried to grab her. The coldness in the air bit at her skin, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The front door was just ahead. It was open. She reached the door, and in a burst of energy, slammed it shut behind her. The voices, the whispers, the figures, they all vanished in an instant. The night air, cold and crisp, filled her lungs, and the stillness of the world outside seemed like a rebirth. Claire had escaped. But as she looked back toward the farmhouse, now distant and silent, she knew one thing: she hadn't truly escaped. The house was still there, waiting. And someday, someone else would move in. And when they did, the knocking would start again. Claire couldn't stop running. She didn't know where her feet were taking her, but her body moved as if it had a mind of its own, pushing her farther and farther away from that accursed house. The cold night air bit at her skin, and the distant chirping of crickets was the only sound accompanying her flight through the darkened landscape. Her mind raced. Had she really escaped? Had she truly broken free from the house? Or had she merely been granted a temporary reprieve? She couldn't shake the feeling that the house, the land itself, was watching her. She could almost hear its whispers, low and insistent, calling to her, beckoning her to return. Come back. You belong with us. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to keep moving, not daring to look over her shoulder. The house loomed in her mind like an ever-present shadow. The knock. The voices. The ghostly figures. They were all still with her, following her, haunting the corners of her thoughts. As Claire reached the edge of the town, she could see the dim lights of the few scattered homes flickering in the distance. The sight should have been comforting, but it wasn't. The town felt so small now, a mere speck in a world that had grown impossibly large and dark. She came to a halt at a small road sign marking the edge of the town. She was close to the highway, close to safety. At least, that's what she tried to tell herself. But a nagging feeling tugged at her, a sensation she couldn't shake. The house was still there, waiting for her to turn around, to walk back and open its door. Suddenly, the silence of the night was broken. A faint sound reached her ears. A soft click. The unmistakable sound of a door opening. Her stomach lurched. Claire spun around, her pulse quickening. She could see the farmhouse in the distance, its silhouette barely visible against the backdrop of the dark woods. It stood there, unmoving, as though it had never been disturbed. Yet, in her mind's eye, she could see the door. The door she had slammed shut so forcefully was now slowly opening again. The whispers returned, faint but growing louder with each passing second. They were calling her name, a chorus of voices, each one more desperate than the last. Claire. Claire. Her feet felt as though they were glued to the earth, her body paralyzed with fear. She tried to turn away, to ignore it, to walk toward the lights of the town, but the sounds were overwhelming. They clawed at her mind, louder now, clearer, almost tangible. Let us in, Claire. Please. We're waiting. We need you. Claire's head throbbed as the pressure of their words closed in on her. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block them out, but the figures came rushing back. The ghostly shapes that had surrounded her in the house, their faces twisted in torment, their cold, clawed hands reaching for her. Their desperate pleas were ingrained in her mind, and the more she tried to forget, the more vivid they became. And then, the unmistakable sound of a footstep. A slow, deliberate step behind her. She turned around sharply, but there was nothing there, no one. Yet, she felt the presence of something, someone, close by. Her heart raced, and her throat tightened. A soft voice whispered in her ear, too close, too intimate. Claire. Her eyes snapped open, but she was alone. Only the vast, empty darkness stretched before her. It's not real. It's not real. She repeated the mantra in her mind, trying to calm herself. But as she forced her eyes to focus on the road ahead, the figure appeared. It materialized out of the misty night, a shadow that didn't belong. A man, his skin pale and ashen, his eyes hollow and vacant, his face twisted in a grotesque smile. The same figure from the house. The one who had reached out to her. She could feel her pulse racing, her breath shallow. The figure didn't speak. It didn't need to. Its presence alone was enough to paralyze her, to fill her mind with panic. Slowly, it took another step toward her. Then another. No. The word reverberated in her mind, but her body didn't respond. She was frozen, rooted to the spot. The figure took a final step toward her, its hollow eyes locked onto hers, and the cold, dead air around it seemed to wrap itself around her, suffocating her. Please, don't leave us, the figure whispered again, its voice like sandpaper scraping across her soul. We need you. You are one of us now. Claire gasped, her eyes widening as the figure stretched out its bony hand. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. Her mind screamed to run, but her body was betraying her. It felt as though the earth beneath her feet was giving way, as though the world itself was pulling her into the darkness. With a sharp, desperate breath, Claire forced herself to move. Her legs screamed in protest, but she willed them to carry her forward. She turned, running with all the strength she had left. The figure's voice echoed behind her, growing louder with each step. Come back, we will wait. You will never escape. The words burned into her mind, searing her thoughts, but she couldn't stop. She wouldn't stop. As she ran, her feet slamming against the dirt road, Claire finally spotted the faint glow of headlights in the distance. A car. A light. Real, human presence. With renewed energy, she pushed herself faster, the sound of her footfalls now accompanied by the faint growl of the figure's voice trailing off behind her. She reached the road's edge just as the car came into view. The headlights of the vehicle illuminated her face, and the car slowed to a stop. The window rolled down, and Claire saw the face of a man staring at her, his expression a mix of concern and confusion. Are you okay? The man asked, his voice laced with alarm. Claire couldn't form words. She was panting, her chest heaving, every ounce of energy drained from her. She had escaped. But had she? Before she could answer, her eyes darted over the man's shoulder. Her breath caught in her throat. From the distance, barely visible in the glow of the car's headlights. The farmhouse stood, unchanged. But now, standing in front of it, was a figure. The same figure. It stared back at her, its hollow eyes glowing in the dark. And beside it, Claire could make out other figures, blurry and indistinct, yet undeniably there. Her mind screamed, and before she could stop herself, she screamed too. "Drive! Please, drive!" She cried out, her voice broken, barely audible. The man in the car hesitated for a moment, confusion on his face, but when he turned to follow her gaze, his eyes widened in terror. His foot slammed on the accelerator, and the car sped off, leaving the road and the figure behind. The farmhouse receded in the distance, and Claire felt the weight of its gaze leave her, but the fear didn't vanish. It lingered, crawling under her skin, sinking deep into her soul. No matter how far she ran, no matter how fast she fled, the house was still out there, waiting. And the knocking, the whispers, the voices, they would never stop. Because they knew her name. They had claimed her. And they would always come for her. The end.